Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Susan Masika. Chances are good that the yogurt you ate this morning had flavors made in Switzerland. Likewise, the shampoo you used probably had a fragrance created here. These are just two of the products coming out of Switzerland, and that people most likely don't know about. Switzerland is a lot more than banking, chocolate, and watches. That's something that author James Breiding set out to tell in his book, Swiss Made, the untold story behind Switzerland's success. Since it came out in 2013, the book has achieved best-selling status and has been translated into 7 languages. More than 50 Swiss embassies around the world offer it as a diplomatic gift. The book outlines how numerous global giants were created within what is a small, landlocked country. Sure, the Swiss produce plenty of milk chocolate, but they also dominate a wide range of industries, from pharmaceuticals and electrical engineering to hearing aids and cement. Author James Breiding is unusual because he has both a Swiss and an outsider's perspective on Switzerland. He grew up in the U.S. with a Swiss father and an American mother, and he holds master's degrees from the IMD Graduate School in Lausanne and the Harvard Kennedy School. And when it comes to finance, he knows what he's talking about, being the former head of a corporate finance group and vice president of Bank Julius Baer. With new laws introduced in 2017 to protect Swiss-made products, Swiss Info's business correspondent, Matthew Allen, caught up with Breiding in our Zurich studio to talk about what exactly is Swissness.
I'd like to start off, first of all, by asking you to define Swiss-made. What is the Swiss-made brand, and what is the Swiss business model that makes it unique?
Well, I think, first of all, it probably would be useful just to sort of review why Switzerland has been successful. John Stuart Mill, he's an 18th century philosopher, said that a successful society should be measured against 2 parameters. One is the greatest good, and then the second one is to what extent that was shared to the greatest number. And if you look at the disposable income of Switzerland, it's very high. It's among the highest among OECD countries, and it also has a very egalitarian structure in terms of sharing and distributing those rewards. So against those 2 parameters, Switzerland has done very well. It's been ranked the most competitive country in the world for 7 years in a row by the World Economic Forum. And if you look at all the sort of standard metrics, whether it's PISA scores for education, savings rates, unemployment rates, inflation, faith in government, CO2 emissions, etc., they score remarkably well. So against that collective context, it is a remarkable story, and it's one that hasn't been told very effectively, and that was really the purpose of writing Swiss Made, the untold story of Switzerland's success. I think at a more granular level, to some extent people might consider them to be cliches, but there are attributes which seem to constitute Swissness, irrespective of whether it's Swatch or Nestle or ABB. And those are things like self-reliance and a strong work ethic, a relatively cautious attitude towards taking risk, reliability, trust, being adaptable, and having a certain sense of modesty. So these seem to be attributes that one comes across and across the entire cross-section of Swiss society and industry. And I think these are aspects that, again, compared to other countries, are quite strong characteristics and if adhered to, should continue to contribute to the continuing success of Switzerland.
And of course, people know many of the well-known Swiss brands, the Nestlé's, Swatch, Credit Suisse, and so on. But there's an enormous breadth and depth to the Swiss brand as well. Perhaps you can give us just a little idea into some of the areas that aren't quite so well known, but which Switzerland has contributed in the business world.
Actually, the interesting thing about Switzerland is that most of it is unknown, and the reason for that is that from an historical perspective, most of the industry in Switzerland is so-called B2B. So the type of businesses that we normally read about in the newspapers, through advertising, for example, or what you would call B2C businesses. So, of course, you've heard of Swatch, and you've heard of Nestle, and you've heard of Lindt Chocolate, because those are what you would call B2C businesses. But most Swiss people have never heard of a company like Firmenich or Givaudan. These are 2 companies which together have the dominant share of of production of just about anything you can imagine that goes into food flavors, and also fragrances. So the shampoo you wash your hair with today, or the perfume you bought your wife, or the yogurt that you ate that was flavored with raspberries, probably have a 70% chance of having come from these two companies. But who among Swiss people really would know those sorts of things? So there's a whole slew of those sorts of businesses out there that just are really outside the radar of public perception, either outside of Switzerland or indeed within Switzerland.
Of course, in every country there are entrepreneurs, people who come up with novel new ideas to improve things. We always hear about the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, the garage startup mentality, the fail until you succeed. But perhaps you can try and define the Swiss entrepreneur.
Look, I just think they're worlds apart. We hear, of course, of Facebooks and Amazons and Googles, and these are just remarkable stories and phenomenal successes. But we don't hear about all the failures, all the attempts that were made to sort of come up with those companies, and the failure rate is enormous. And of course, these are wonderful companies, but frankly, there are 3 or 4 companies that have just been phenomenal successes, but there's just been a lot of failure to get to that. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, you hear about these things because everyone has a Facebook account. Everybody uses Google. Who hasn't bought a product on Amazon? So again, these are B2C businesses which lend themselves to advertising, where these companies have a deep interest in making sure that they're known to a broad number of consumers. In the case of Switzerland, the more successful you are, if you're selling products to industrial buyers, probably the more discreet you'd like to be, because you don't want to invite further competition. That's also been an attribute that I probably should have mentioned before, that historically Swiss companies have been far more discreet and have boasted much less about their success. I even spoke the other day to a famous Swiss company, just to give you an idea, and we were talking about public relations, and they said they have a public relations advisor that they hire to keep them out of the press. So, that's quite a different story than Instagram or Facebook, which actually has a mission of making themselves as visible as possible.
Well, one of those successful factors has been the Swiss quality label, Swiss made, the Swiss cross on your product. As of 2017, there will be legislation defining exactly how much Swiss material has to be contained within the Swiss product, how much Swiss know-how, in order for it to keep that Swiss-made label. Some people say, well, that's great at keeping the strength of the Swiss quality, stopping it from eroding. Other people say, well, in the world of globalization, it's unrealistic and puts Swiss companies at a disadvantage. How important is the Swiss quality made label, and do you think it's necessary to enshrine it in this legislation?
Well, I think what's positive about it is flattering. Clearly there's value in preserving this sort of brand of Swissness. You can see that's a good thing. Clearly if it was not valuable, people wouldn't go to the effort of trying to regulate it. I personally am on balance against it. Notwithstanding the fact that the intent is to try to keep people from copying Swiss technologies or perception that the product is produced in Switzerland. I think it's going to just be very difficult to measure and to execute. And I think it also goes very much against the way business is conducted now and will continue to be conducted in the future. If you take an iPhone, it consists of probably 1,000 different parts. It's very difficult to say whether an iPhone is produced in Silicon Valley or Hong Kong or Shenzhen or whatever. So I think that's going to be the difficulty, is really just to figure out how one measures and enforces that. Companies like Ems or companies like Bürle Utzwil or Swiss companies, because they've been around for 50 or 100 years, and to what extent those products are produced in Switzerland or elsewhere, I think is secondary. I think what's important is who's taking the decisions, who's responsible for the quality control. And if that's in Switzerland, to a lot of people that may be sufficient as opposed to where it's actually produced.
Okay, let's talk about the future. If you were to rewrite your book in 10 years' time, in 30 years' time even, given the changing nature of the world, particularly with a fourth industrial revolution upon us. How do you see Swiss Made going forward in the future, given the challenges, given the opportunities that it's facing at the moment? Do you think it's going to be pretty much the same as you've written in your book, or do you think there's going to be some fundamental changes as to the way the Swiss make things?
Well, I'm pretty optimistic about Switzerland's future. You know, we're all sort of stirring the same pot, if you like. I mean, we have some sort of global trends which are affecting everyone, irrespective of where they're living. As you mentioned, the internet and the digitalization of society is having and will continue to have massive impact on how one conducts business, how one conducts social relationships, and that will continue. You have this enormous wage arbitration between very poor countries and very rich countries. You have increasing tension between the haves and the have-nots, and I think these are issues that you see in Switzerland, but you see elsewhere. So I think the Swiss will have to come up with their own formulas with having to deal with that. I think, you know, by and large, what's good about Switzerland is that they have kind of a model which is quite unique, which is conferring relatively strong strength among industry participants and with a relatively weak central government. And that's very unique to find that. Usually it's the opposite or the other way around. So you usually have a very strong central government and industrial players are politically quite weak. So if the Swiss can continue to keep that formula, and that seems to be within their DNA to distrust sort of central authority of any type, and letting the entrepreneurs and letting the industrial participants, you know, behave in a much more robust manner. I think that's quite a good thing. And I think if they continue to have a government which is intent upon providing the right framework, the right conditions to be successful, as opposed to trying to prescribe what it takes to be successful, then I think that speaks well to Switzerland. It has its challenges, and some of probably the key issues going forward with Switzerland will depend on how they resolve some of these challenges. From a sectoral point of view, there are tremendous pressures with the banking sector, with tourism, with the pharmaceutical sector. They will probably have a much more difficult generation than they've had in the past. And these are the three sectors which have historically been very positive in terms of contributing to Swiss prosperity. At the individual level, I think, you know, the Swiss, because of their sense of caution, they have an aversion to risk, an aversion to fear of failing. And the fact is, with innovation, there's a high cost of innovating, and there's no such thing as innovating without making mistakes and without taking risks. And if we knew what something was going to be, there would be no need to innovate. So it's really sort of indigenous to innovation that there's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of failure that's required to achieve something. So I think the stigma that's attached to failing, you know, that's something that has to be revised quite strongly in Switzerland.
James Breiding talking to Matthew Allen. For more on Breiding's book, Swiss Made, go to swissinfo.ch and search for our article, Author Sets the Story Straight. Swiss Made was the second book by Breiding on Switzerland. He also wrote a book in German on the nation's economic success called Wirtschaftswunder Schweiz. Thanks for listening, and thank you to studio technician Daniel Wheeler. Additional production this week by Jessica Dacey. Signing off for all of us, I'm Susan Masika.